Hey everyone, it's Cam here, welcoming you to another episode of The Build Room. In this week's episode, we are taking a break from cutting and welding and grinding. If that's what you're here for, don't worry, just look at any of the last 5 episodes, you'll get your fill of that. But in this week's episode, we're getting down and dirty underneath Violet Crumbles and we're pulling that gearbox. So stick around and check it out. Okay, so in our last episode, we pulled out that rusty brace that was going across the cabin and filled up some of the last areas that need to be repaired before we get started with painting the underbody. Now, during that episode, I did mention that there was a brake line that was running down the side of the gearbox, and I couldn't get that out of the way because in order to do that, I needed to remove the gearbox crossmember. And then I thought, well, if I'm pulling the gearbox crossmember, I've already got the tail shaft out, I've already got the clutch slave off. There's not that much extra work to pull the gearbox. And by pulling the gearbox, it'll allow me to do 2 things. Firstly, is it'll make it a little bit easier to replace the seals that I want to replace because the rear output shaft of that gearbox was leaking a little bit of oil when I pulled the tail shaft out the first time. And secondly, I want to be able to do the underbody protectant all the way up through the transmission tunnel. And that wouldn't be possible with the gearbox in place where it is now. Now, to get that gearbox out, we're going to have to do some work in the engine bay, in the interior, and obviously underneath the car. So let's get stuck into it. Okay, so I'm running a little bit of a cheat mode here. Obviously having most of the interior out is an easy way to start. There are still some things. We basically need to get the gear shift lever out so that when we go to obviously pull the gearbox, we don't have this hitting the transmission tunnel. Normally you'd have to take the center console out, and then what we're gonna do is strip off this boot, take off the gear knob, slide the boot off, and then there are a couple of screws around the base of the gear knob retaining plate, and we're going to remove them, and then it just slides out. So we'll get this out of the way and then we'll jump into the engine bay. So this is actually a non-standard boot that's been inserted into what looks like the standard retainer. Normally you'll have a slightly smaller rubber boot and it will have a leather gaiter over it that clips into the console. So we just move these aside. They're only 10mm nuts. Okay, so that retaining plate will be free now. Just take off the gear knob, it just screws off. Might take a little bit to crack, but so newer cars tend to actually press on and pull off. But yeah, these older cars are all threaded, as you can see. So now we can get the gaiter off. Okay, so you can see here, this is actually the OEM rubber seal. So this top part here normally connects into this, and then this connects onto that. So this is all disintegrated, and you legally have to have a good seal here, and it's also a smart move to do in general, because what this does is it stops any exhaust fumes that might be leaking from coming up into the cabin. So what someone's done is they've just put a generic one in its place, which would have done the job. I will probably try and find another one of these. I don't know how easy they are to get anymore. If not, we might be looking at that one temporarily. So let's get this off. Okay. Then there is this seal in here. Just break all this away. This second seal, that one right there. That seal, this is all brittle and broken as well, so I won't be doing anything, but that should stretch and just pop around there, and that's really just to keep dust and sand out of this mechanism, right? Because obviously if this was open after 50 years, you would likely see a whole bunch of sand and dirt and other grit that was locking up the mechanisms. So now we've just got these 4 bolts to come off, and then the lever will pop out. Okay, it's got a bit of spring to it. See the spring mechanism underneath that ball? Basically, you've got 2 runners on either side of that ball to keep it stable laterally. And if you have a look at the mechanism, so it'll sit on these 2 pins and pivot on them. And then if you look down there, there's a bucket, and that will take that ball at the end of the lever. Okay, so that's as far as we need to go. We don't need to start taking off this extension housing or anything like that. we should have plenty of room to get the gearbox out without going any further. So if we move into the engine bay, we've already got a few things out of the way here already, but generally speaking, what we're gonna have to remove is the starter motor here, which just has a bolt top and bottom. We're just gonna loosen that and move it out of the way. We're not gonna take it out of the bay altogether. And then there's a couple of bolts on the bell housing here and on the other side around there. If we move to the other side of the bay, there's really not that much we need to get out on this side. As I said, we do have the bolt at the top of the bell housing. And then if you look down towards the bottom, I'll see if I can zoom in on that. There's some braces right down at the bottom between the engine block and the gearbox. They have some bolts that actually go in from this side, so we'll just keep an eye on them. They'll be easier to get out from underneath the car, so we'll grab them when we're underneath. But to be honest, there's not really that much we need to do. And luckily on these cars, unlike newer cars, everything's pretty easy to get to. I mean, getting to this bolt here, I can basically get to that right now with a open-ended spanner or a ring spanner without needing to get a bunch of extension arms on and getting it from underneath the car, because there's just so much room to work here. So yeah, there's a few bolts to get rid of, but it shouldn't be too much of a hassle. Now, I think the bottom one's probably easier from the underside of the car, so we'll pop under there. Okay, so I thought I'd taken the slave off. It looks like I haven't, so I'll take that off now. Nothing really to it, a couple of 12 mils. These feel like they've all been done up with a rattle gun. As we undo this, that spring will loosen off. Probably might be able to pull it off. Oh, yeah, pull it off now. Okay, and free. So obviously I disconnected this end. I thought I'd disconnected the entire thing. Now we can get nice access to this starter motor bolt. This will be tight, so I'm going to use the 2 spanner trick. Oh, just to crack it. Now we might be able to get a socket in there. Okay. And the starter should pull out off the stud and disengage. Okay, so that's going to be okay hanging there for a minute. I won't leave it there too long. I'll just jump up and move it somewhere in the bay. Okay, so we've got the starter motor sitting on the cross member here out of the way. We'll just get this last bolt out on this side, which is 17. All right, that one's out. Okay. Okay, with all that off, we should be able to do the rest of it from underneath the car. Okay, so looking from the rear of the gearbox, you can see we've got the cross member still attached. This is the offending line that I can't get out without, there's a clip up here, and I could pull this backwards and push it forwards, but until I can undo the clip, which is right up in there, and is very difficult to get to, I won't be able to get any tools on it really. So until I can get that out, I am stuck. So I'm going to leave the cross member in place from now. This is where I'm going to put the jack, and we'll lower it down across this, mainly because it's a nice, easy way not to damage any of the housings or anything like that on the gearbox. This gearbox weighs about 40 kilos, I think it is, 40, 50 kilos. So you don't want to try and bring it down by yourself, mainly because, you know, the second something gets caught up, you're not going to be able to get out from under it. So yeah, I'm going to lower it onto a jack as best I can. If this doesn't work out to be viable as a position to put the jack, because I haven't pulled one of these out before, I'll at least move up to here towards the center of the gearbox, where this part of the gearbox is steel, whereas the bell housing and the rear tail of it are aluminium. So obviously we've got more strength in this position. So yeah, now it's just a case of pulling out all the bolts around the bell housing. Now, even with all those bolts removed from the front, this wouldn't move backwards because we do have the cross member holding it in. So I can pull all those off, get the jack into position, and once the jack's into position, I can just drop it down onto it. And hopefully at that point, I'll be able to just pull the bell housing backwards. It has to separate from the basically the input shaft that goes into the spigot bearing on the engine. But around that shaft, you have the clutch and everything. So you should have to move it back a fair way, probably about 2 to 3 inches before you'll be able to get that input shaft down past the clutch housing. Otherwise, you can actually bend those clutch forks if you're going a bit hard, so you just got to be careful to really pull it out. The engine will naturally drop at the back, and what we'll do is put a piece of wood between the back of the head and the firewall so that when it does tilt backwards, it doesn't damage that, especially if you've got a nicely painted engine bay. You want to put some cloths and some wood in there, because this cross member is the only other thing that's stopping that engine from tilting. Yeah, as we pull the gearbox off, the engine's going to want to drop backwards, so you just need to be ready for that. And sometimes you need it to drop backwards because you actually need to get that tilt so the gearbox will come down further so you can move it back without hitting the firewall here. And we've actually got about probably, I would say 2 inches of movement that we can get here, but as I said, we might need sort of anywhere from 2 to 3 inches to get past the clutch and the flywheel. So yeah, having that engine movement and being able to drop it down may help us out there. Okay, so yeah, we just have to undo those 6 bolts and then we'll be ready to stabilize the jack either under the cross member or at the center of the gearbox. Undo the cross member bolts, and there's 4 of those. They're just 12mm bolts, and we should be able to get this box out. Okay, so we've got all those bolts off now. The bell housing itself is actually starting to move away, just with the general small amount of movement that it's got. It's already starting to separate from the back of the engine, which is good. So now we just need to get the jack in place, and then we'll slide it back slowly until it releases, and hopefully it'll be caught by the jack and we can lower it down fairly, in a fairly controlled manner. Down, we're just gonna put that wood behind the head. Okay, it's kind of resting on the gearbox and the back step of the block, but should be fine. Just in case this does want to close that gap, we'll protect it from bending these pipes or anything like that. I'd say we'd probably be okay, but better to be safe than sorry. Okay, I'm going to call a quick timeout here to talk about safety. So firstly, I'm not a mechanic. The videos I'm showing you are what I'm doing to my car. You need to check what's going to be appropriate for your own car. All care, no responsibility. The second thing is, when it comes to safety, you've got to determine what's right for you. Now, I am taking this off with a jack. You'll see people ratchet strap the gearbox to jacks. You'll see people use specific gearbox jacks and things like that. And if you've got access to all that stuff, that's fine. I'm just making sure that I'm not putting myself under the gearbox. You'll see as we pull it out, I'm sitting under the engine, which is secured in place. Gearbox was to fall off the jack, it would fall on the floor, probably about, a foot in front of my head. So I feel comfortable that I'm safe in this one, but you need to make your decision. Anyway, everyone hates health and safety stuff, so let's get back into it. Stop. Okay, so you've just taken the weight off, which is good. Now I'm going to take the cross member out, so the jack will be the only thing holding it up. All right, so what I'm going to do is move the gearbox back. You might need to just let your jack down ever so slightly. Stop. Yeah, well, the whole engine's tilting, so it's fine. See how it's getting looser? Okay. Okay, now we're free. All right, we're free. Now just start to lower it. This is the sketchiest thing I've ever caught on camera. Yeah, it's starting to lower. You can probably do it a little bit faster. That's good, just leave it there. Okay. All right, it's down. We just gotta get it off the jack. So my helper is gonna pull the jack out in 3, 2, 1. Oh, and we're down. Okay, so the gearbox is out. It's on a very flash plastic tray. I have a selection of degreasers and brushes. So we're gonna get this cleaned up, and then while this dries out, we're gonna jump back under the car and take a look at the clutch and flywheel assembly and see where we stand with that stuff. So let's get to cleaning. Okay, so looking at the transmission tunnel with the gearbox out now, everything looks pretty good. Very nice and sound structurally through here, no damage. This here is the clip that I needed to be able to undo to get this line out. Now, what I was going to do was just drop the gearbox down and then sort of wedge a spanner up here to undo it, but realistically, this is probably the easiest solution I have of pulling the gearbox out. It lets me do a little bit of work to that at the time. The mount areas are good, they just need to be cleaned up a little bit. And we should be okay. And if you look here, we can see the block of wood, and that block of wood is wedged in there hard as the weight of the engine is pinning the wood between the firewall and the head. So you definitely want that in there. This one's actually a bit thin. I would probably recommend putting, this is a 35mm piece of wood. I would be putting something more along the lines of a couple of inches or 50mm at least, but it did get the job done. Okay, so looking at the clutch and flywheel assembly, it does look pretty new. It's a DK branded pressure plate and a Luck clutch. DK, I believe, is like the standard version of Excetti in Japan. So I don't think this is a performance clutch by any standard. It's probably just an OEM type replacement. But you know, it's all clean. It's looking pretty good in terms of its serviceability. I'm gonna leave it there and not mess around with it. The clutch didn't shudder or show any signs of failure before I took the gearbox off, so I'm just gonna leave it as it is, knowing that I'm gonna do something with the engine later on and we'll probably need a new clutch at that point. The other good piece of news is that the flywheel looks good. There's no damage to the ring gear or anything like that. And behind the flywheel, there's no oil. So there is some oil around the edges, which is sort of to be expected considering there's a lot of oil on the underside of the car in general. But behind the flywheel and along this plate, there doesn't seem to be any, which leads me to believe the rear main seal on this car is probably good, which is a bonus, because otherwise I would have to pull all the clutch, flywheel and everything off, pull off the housing and replace the rear main seal as well. Again, not something I want to do when I'm going to change this engine out at some point. The gearbox is on the bench now, so we can have a good look at it. Okay, so the gearbox is cleaned up. It's on the bench now, looking really spiffy, pretty clean indeed. Before we get too far into what we're going to do to this though, I just want to explain what was happening with all this as I was trying to get the gearbox out. Now, this is the input shaft here, and this area here sits in the spigot bearing, right? And then the clutch plate sits over this. The pressure plate itself doesn't come into contact with this in any way, shape or form. It's simply the clutch plate sitting on there, and that transfers the force between the flywheel and the input shaft, which transmits it back through the gearbox. Okay, so high-tech visualization time here. We have an engine and a gearbox, and when we bolt those two together, we get basically quite a strong connection, and the points of support are on the front of the engine cross member, so the engine mount here at the front third of the engine, and then on the back of the gearbox about here. Now that's fine when the units are bolted together, but as you start to unbolt the gearbox, what you're going to do is separate these two. And when they're only supported front and back, what you're going to end up doing is breaking the back of it, and they will drop down like that due to the weight. The engine will want to tip towards the back of the engine bay, and the gearbox will want to fall off its front mount. And if you look closely at the footage when I'm unbolting it, you can actually see the point at which it disconnects and it starts to break that back. And when you end up with that, disconnecting them is very difficult because everything's under such intense pressure. So the input shaft is basically bound up on the clutch and in the spigot bearing, and nothing's going to come out nicely, which is why what we did was remove the back mount, and then as we dropped that down, once they got back into alignment and this had dropped fully in the bay, then everything came out really quite easily and smoothly. If you're struggling to get the gearbox out, you're either hitting on something in the transmission tunnel, or you don't have this angle correctly, or there's something broken in the clutch flywheel assembly. But generally speaking, if you've got a car that is working pretty well, these should come apart quite nicely without any effort. You don't need to be manhandling it or hammering it, or even a light lever with a screwdriver is good to get it started, but you shouldn't have to have any sort of serious leverage going on. So yeah, keep it in line overall and it should come off quite nicely. Okay, so looking back at the gearbox, outside of the bell housing, you can see here is where the clutch slave cylinder mounts up, and that actuates this arm. It moves it forward and backwards, and then when it's moving that, basically this arm here is pushing the carrier and the release bearing forward, and that release bearing basically rides on the fingers of the clutch and applies pressure to engage or disengage depending on which way your clutch functions. And this is the input shaft where the clutch sits, and this smaller end to the input shaft is what rides inside the spigot bearing on the back of the crankshaft that the flywheel sits around. Now the problem that we have with this is it has been leaking oil. You can see down here there's evidence of an oil leak, and I didn't clean this well, but there's quite a lot down here that's really crusty. So what we're going to do here is we're going to remove the clutch arm, the carrier and the release bearing so that we can get nice easy access to this. And I'm hoping that all I need to do is remove these bolts here, and then this cover will come off and I can replace the seal. That's a big maybe. I haven't pulled this off before, so I may end up having to remove the bell housing itself, which is just sort of 7 bolts, and this will come off. Cool things about this gearbox. So in the 80s and 90s, these were a really popular gearbox because you could split them just here, just remove the whole bell housing, and you could bolt a new bell housing on. And companies like Dello Automotive and other groups like that made custom bell housings that would bolt in here and then attach to any engine like a Holden Red 202 motor or something like that to give a 5-speed gearbox to some of the cars that didn't have it, which is really kind of cool. And Celica steel cases were popular for that conversion. So anyway, let's get this off now and we'll see where we are with the seal. These are the seals. It's just a W50 kit from Dello Automotive as well. Front and rear, although I haven't checked these. So there could be a premature end to this episode if these don't fit, but let's see how we go. Basically just have to take the retaining pin out, and then once that's off, the entire carrier for the release bearing will come out. There's a second one on the bottom there that I didn't see, but anyway, it's off. And then the fork will come out. Now, the fork basically press fits, but not hard. It's just sort of just a light mount to a ball on the back of the bell housing here. So you basically got to push the fork inwards to get the retaining piece out of the way, and then the whole arm will come out like that. And it's going to be caught up, but there we go. So you can see that retaining spring here, basically holding it against that ball. And then if we look up close, you can see the pivot point for the clutch fork. That should have some grease on it. I'll re-grease that before it all goes together. And you can also see here the area that we're trying to seal and the amount of leakage that it's seen. All right, and looking up close, I can already see the problem that I'm gonna have here, which is a very small amount of room to get a socket over it. So the distance between the bell housing here and the edge of this bolt is not big enough to get that socket over it. But that's okay, because I reckon if I get a thinner walled socket like this little 1/4" one, yes, we're on top. So this may work. I still think this is probably going to be tight, but No harm, no foul. I'll try and get it off, and if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. All right, beautiful. So there you go. You can avoid removing the bell housing, provided you use the right size socket. Now that is the little friend in there that we need to get out. It is a reverse setup. So normally when you're driving a seal in, you would have the closed over end to drive this in. It's actually reversed, right? So we've got to lever this one out. So let's get this in the vise and do that. Okay. And when you lever this out, a screwdriver is fine to use. Just make sure you don't put it too far in because you can gouge the surface that it's going to connect to. So there we go. And out. So we'll just give the surface a clean out. Just make sure you got a really nice clean surface for the seal to go into. You don't have to lubricate the inside of this at all, but you do need it clean. All right, then we drop our seal into place. Just do it by hand and try and get a good feel for it before you drop it in. Because if it's not even, you run the risk of damaging it. What I'm actually going to do here is, because we need to get it to seat all the way to the bottom of that ledge, so I'm going to use the old seal as a driver for the new one, because I don't want to damage the surface of that one. So with that in place, I can take my fancy new seal driver here and basically stamp that down. Normally this would be the other way around, but because this is a backward seal, that needs to be backwards because we don't have the right diameter. All right, and then I'm just going to run some grease around the inside of it, just for when we slide it over that input shaft. All right, we've just got some surface rust around where that bearing is going to sit, so I'm just going to clean that up with a brass brush. And just like I greased the seal, I'm going to grease the input shaft, just lightly, because obviously there'll be fluid running behind this normally. So we don't want a bunch of heavy grease running through the gearbox oil. Okay, when you go to slide the case over, there's only one way to do it. The bolt spacings are uneven, so you can only put this in one way. Just be careful when you're sliding over the input shaft not to nick the seal. Slide it over, get it located as best you can. Slide it home, then we can put the bolts back in. All right, that's all moving sweet. Clean this pivot point as well. And I'm not going to put the arm and the carrier and everything back in because I'm actually going to replace the release bearing. This one's moving quite nicely, but it is making a little bit of noise. They tend to last a long time, but they make noise. So no need to replace the clutch, but I'll just throw a new one of these in just to quieten it down a bit. So now we have to look at the seal on the back. Okay, so this is the output shaft of the gearbox. This metal piece here is actually a steel cover with a felt insert, and basically the yoke of the tail shaft slides in across there over the output shaft and seals against the felt. Not from fluid, just from dirt and dust and things. Behind this is actually the rubber seal. The rubber seal looks like that. It should just fit over the output shaft fairly snugly. But we're gonna get this metal off first. Now, there is a special tool to get this off. I don't have it. If I jerry-rigged up something in terms of a slide hammer and something else, that would be probably workable, but I think this rear extension housing cover comes off as well. So I'm going to try and take this off first, and then we should be able to get behind that seal. Okay. All right, so we've got a little bit of movement there. We just want to make sure we're taking this off evenly so it doesn't go on an angle and bind up. Okay, housing's off. Okay, now when we try and lever this out, because I don't think it's going to come out smoothly, but we won't be going in on an angle like that. We can certainly have something that's a bit more shallow, and I may be able to bend up a small piece of metal to hook in there. I've tried to lever it, I've tried to pull it with one of these things, but they're just not strong enough and get behind there. But yeah, I can't really pull with it. So what I'm going to try and do is either pop this into my slide hammer, or I just made this, which was just grinding down a bolt so that it has on the end of it, let's see if I can show you, so that it has like a hook shape on the end of it, which will hopefully go behind there. Then I can use the slide hammer. Let's see if that works. Oh, look at that. That is impressive. So yeah, it's full of felt. And it's just a metal shell on the outside. Now we can see the seal that needs to come out. So that's the next thing I've got to pull out. That'll probably lever out pretty easy and I don't mind damaging it. Obviously I don't want to damage this because I don't have a replacement. But the seal that's gone in there looks about the right size too. So we'll get this out. Try the puller first just to see. Nope. Definitely want to lever this one out. All right, it's getting real ugly now. I'm just going to fold this up. That is very ugly. Anyway, like I said, I don't want to damage the inside race. The burring that I've put here, I'll just quickly take off with a bit of emery paper. Again, we're just going to give it a brush so that the surfaces that the seals are going for are good, and a little bit of cleaner just to make sure that none of that aluminium I just filed off stays in there and there's no other garbage. This is just a soft plastic brush. It's nothing that's going to damage in here. Okay, so this is all nice and clean in here. There's no sharp burrs or anything. I know it looks pretty ugly on the outside, but it's nice and smooth in here and clean. We're going to get the seal driven all the way to the back. I would normally like to use a seal driver, but unfortunately with the output shaft there, that's not going to work. So I'm going to just try and seat this as nicely as I can by hand. And then I'm going to use the biggest socket I've got to see if I can drive it in. I'm just going to do that softly because there's not a lot of supporting structure behind this part of the seal. I don't want to end up bending it. Right, so that's flush, but it's not all the way to the back. So I think I'm just going to have to use a big drift and be really careful here. All right, that's seated. I am going to put a little bit of grease in here if I can make it happen. Probably should have put it on before the seal, but anyway. Okay, now we put the felt back in. And now it's just the housing cover to go back on. This one, I'm going to use a block. Okay, so you can see we're finished up here. We've got the housing right back where it needs to be. And then as we move around the front, you can see the output shaft, the felt retainer, everything's back in place. So yeah, while the removal of that rear seal wasn't pretty, I think all of the seals are in place and seated well, so we should be good to go. Okay, so that's pretty much where I'm going to call it a day. So I am glad that I dropped the gearbox. Changing out those seals gives me a little bit of peace of mind and less likely to get oil leaks that are going to cause me problems down the track. Plus which I can now remove that fuel line that's inside the transmission tunnel and start prepping the underbody for paint. And yeah, it's been good to take a break from all the cutting, grinding and welding and just throw a bit of variety in there. And I'm not going to commit to going back to the prep for the next episode. In fact, at this stage, I have no idea what I'm gonna do. So I guess you're just gonna have to tune in to find out. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. And if you're new to the channel, as usual, I'll put a link to the full Violet Crumbles series here and also some episodes from the A90 series here. Other than that, I just want to say thanks for watching and I'll see you next time on the Build Room. Bye for now.